Hi, this is Chris Parker with Marine Weather Center, and I want to introduce you to Ocean's WeatherNet and Ocean's GRIB Explorer. I've used these for about the last 12 or 13 years. Couldn't do my job as a weather forecaster and weather router without them. The two work together, but they're also standalone programs that you can use with other programs. WeatherNet is a way to access over 10,000 weather products, many of them in gridded format. And GRIB Explorer is a Windows software. Now, there's also a Mac software version in the year 2015. It lacks a few features that the Windows program has. So this is the Windows-based version of Ocean's GRIB Explorer that we'll look at in a moment. So I come in the morning and I download a weather file, and that weather file takes just a few seconds to download. And now it says transfer is done. We can close that window and GRIB Explorer launches automatically. This is what GRIB Explorer looks like out of the box. If you select a smaller geographic area than I select, then you will have a smaller geographic area of data, maybe something like this on your computer screen. And all that's fine, but I think we can make the screen look better and the information more useful if we do a few tweaks to both the background map and the weather data. So one key point to realize is that the weather information that we are looking at here is in gridded format. It's ones and zeros, it's raw data, it is not an image. The software program renders an image. It's kind of like the difference between raster charts and vector charts if you use charting software. A raster chart is a photographic image of a chart that is then put on your computer screen. And contrast that with a vector chart, which allows you to paint and unpaint buoys, paint and unpaint all sorts of information on the screen, and customize the screen to look however you want to look. It's not going to look like the paper chart. That's the raster software. The raster software is just a picture of the paper chart. The vector software takes the raw data that's on the paper chart and paints it in whatever fashion you want to look at it. We've got red and green buoys. If you want to paint the red buoys purple, it would be easy to write a computer program to paint the red buoys purple, if that's the way you want to see your red buoys. I imagine that could be useful for someone who's red-green colorblind. They could use a vector chart and paint things colors other than red and green. In any event, what we're looking at here is basically a vector chart. It is the raw data, and it's painted in whatever fashion we want to paint it by the computer program. The first thing I want to do is to change the base map. So you see the base map has the shoreline in outline, but everything else is just black. And I'm going to change how the base map looks. So in order to do that, I need to close the weather file, which I just did. So now we're going to go to the option Chart and GRIB option. Notice that under Chart and Options, we have a black and white screen, black and white outline. We click on that. We can bring up all sorts of monochrome color schemes. We can bring up all sorts of duplex color schemes. And we can also bring up all sorts of other color schemes. The one I like best is the true color option. This actually paints the ocean in various shades of blue based on water depth, and the land in various shades of green and brown in terms of what the land looks like. So that will be our base map. By default, the latitude and longitude intervals are 5 degrees each, I believe. And there may be a few things that are different in your default version of GRIB Explorer than the way I have this set now. So I've been using a heavily customized way of viewing data in WeatherNet, and that's what I'm going to show you now. I tried to unset everything back to the factory default values, but I don't recall what all of the factory default values were. So I think we need to change the latitude and longitude interval. You can make these 1 degrees, 2 degrees, 3 degrees. I find 1 degree is too cluttered, and 2 degrees is about right. So 2 degrees of latitude and longitude, that's how the geographic grid will be painted in a dashed line. I can change how that line looks if I prefer something other than a dashed line, but I think a dashed line is just fine for that. Coastlines, I'm going to outline in a color that is really, really bright. So I'm going to choose a bright green, maybe the third green down on the list of green colors to be the coastline. I'm going to paint the political boundaries in a bright red, kind of a bright purplish red, the third red down, or is it the second red down? Yeah, let's do the second red down. And I'm going to paint the states and provinces in a really dark purple, that fourth one down. Now, this will not show very thick, prominent lines, so I'm going to increase the thickness of the lines. And one small thing I've noted with at least previous versions of the software is if we make the lines too thick, then it can slow the program down a little bit. So, oh, and I need to, I'm trying to right click, but I'm unsuccessful in pulling down the drop down menu because I need to check political boundaries and check states and provinces. Then I can right click and select the line thickness. Right click and select the line thickness. And I'm actually going to select thicker lines. So those are all the changes that I want to make to the base map. So we click OK, and now when I go to load my data, at least the background map is going to look different. Here's the background map, and you can see that's very definitely different. So now we have our file open up again, and we can see the full color background image of the world, or of this section of the world, and we can see that the coastline's in bright green and that the states are in a dark purple and that the international borders are in kind of a bright fuchsia. The weather data doesn't look much different. Now let's adjust the weather data so that it appears more meaningful. First, I want to adjust the wind, and we do that by clicking on, let me just show you what the screen would look like if we did not have the default properties, the properties up. So it would look like this. On the screen we have information that is cursor dependent at the bottom of the screen. It lists the wind speed wherever the cursor is, the wind direction, the pressure, total precipitation, and lifted index, latitude and longitude of the cursor. We can put a place mark on the chart and get a range and bearing to that place mark. And the times are in UTC time, at least that's the way I've got it set, and I don't have a GPS hooked up. So that's the little status bar at the bottom of the screen. But I want to change some of the properties. So I'm going to go up to this button here underneath the Help menu item, and that's the Properties panel. So I click on Properties panel, and this may be open by default when the program launches, but if it isn't, you can click it by launch it by clicking Properties panel. And I'm going to select Plot Options and Wind Speed. So wind speed and direction are currently flags. If we want something other than flags, we can use solid arrows like that. Solid arrows that change in size based on how strong the wind is. Look at units in meters per second, knots, feet, kilometers per hour, however you want to look at the units. I like knots. So I'm going to go back to wind flags because I like the wind flags. And the color palette, because there's so much information on the screen, I'm just going to paint all the wind flags a single color. I'll show you in a few minutes the time profile, which gives us far more in-depth data, information about each parameter, what we're looking at for wind speed and direction. So it's more useful here just to have the wind flags in a nice yellow that stands out well against the background, like so. And I'm going to display values. Now there is a number rounded to a single decimal place by the base of each wind flag, and that shows us at this time what the weather forecast is at each, in this case, half degree of latitude and half degree of longitude, anywhere we want in the world, within the area of data that we've downloaded. And so that's really neat. And if I change the time, and I'll show you how to do that in a minute, then I change all this data. So that's what we want to do to the wind flags. Just change the color to yellow and add the display values. The next thing we're going to do is surface pressure. And notice default contours is checked. We are going to uncheck default contours. And I want to paint an isobar, the pressure isobars. I want to paint those every single millibar of pressure. But I don't want to start at 0 because there's never 0 pressure in the atmosphere. I'm going to start at something a little bit below the normal surface pressure, say 980 millibars. And I'm going to go with an interval of 1 millibar. Weather facts charts that you typically get, those have an isobar every 4 millibars of pressure change. I'm going to paint this with an isobar every 1 millibar of pressure change. And I'm going to need about 50 of them because I'm starting at 980 millibars and I want to go up to 1030. So this is going to show an isobar at every single millibar from 980 to 1030, anywhere within the chart data. And for the color scheme here, I'm going to choose the one that goes from yellow to orange to red. And again, that's in order to make the chart a little bit simpler to look at. Notice these lines aren't very prominent, so we are going to make these lines much more bold, like that. And it might be nice to actually have a visual cue as to what the isobars are. So we can do that under contour lines. And I've loaded in contour lines, or contour labels rather. I've loaded in contour labels that are somewhat customized. We can customize them by clicking on those tools, that little tool icon there. I've chosen an opaque background that is orange in color to match the orange isobar. I've chosen a font that is, I believe, Arial, bold, and 16 point. We can use decimal places if we want, but I've asked for these to be every millibar starting from 980, so these are going to be whole numbers anyway, so it would just display 0.0. And I can choose a different font color if I like. I can choose any of these colors if I would prefer a different font color for the number against the background. We can do an outline, we can do an underline, we can do all sorts of fun things with the contour labels. So that's how I like the contour labels, so we'll leave that there. So that's all we're going to do to the pressure isobars. Let's adjust the lifted index. Now, the lifted index is a measure of instability of the atmosphere, and again, this is just painting the default contour lines, and they're pretty thin, and there's no visual cue as to what they are. And what's important with lifted index is the deviation from 0, essentially. So I'm going to deselect default contours. I'm going to want 20 contour lines. I'm going to want to start at a -10 and go up at an interval of 1. So this is going to paint 20 contour lines from -10 to -9 to -8 to +8 to +9 to +10 and everything in between. And then I'm going to make these lines thicker, and I am going to, I changed the color palette. So the color palette that I like for this is the black to the white, and we're going to put contour labels on each one. And those contour labels I've chosen to make with a green background because not much else is green, with a similar font to the pressure. So green background, opaque background, white letters in Arial bold at 16 point. So that's what we're going to do to the lifted index contour lines. Let's go look at precipitation. We are going to once again take off default contours so we can put in whatever sort of contours we want. We are going to make this a color-filled area. We are going to use 24 different gradients of color. We're going to start at 0.025 inches of precipitation and go up 0.025 inches per contour color. And we are going to change the color palette to, do we like that one better? No, actually the first color palette is probably the best, and your screen may vary, but I'm going to choose that first color palette. That seems to be pretty reasonable. And we can make the transparency anything we want. If we want to be able to see through the data a little better, we can make it maybe 80 or 85% transparent, and that way the precipitation isn't very prominent. The default is to reset this to about 0, and that makes the precipitation so prominent that we really can't see anything else on the screen. So I usually choose something around 50% or 60%, but your mileage may vary depending on how you want to see it. So that's what we're going to do with the customization of weather parameters. And now we can close the Properties panel, and this information will be retained the next time we launch the program. We can get rid of the color key, and here is the most important feature of GRIB Explorer, the time profile. So I click on the vertical squiggly line, the time profile, and that brings up this box that displays wherever my cursor is every 6 hours, say for the next 7 days, all of the weather data that's in this data file for that position. So I'll walk you through it. The yellow line at the very left edge is the precipitation, and anytime that yellow line comes up off of 0, there's going to be some precipitation. The blue line is the lifted index, and notice that the first line is -10, third line there is -2.42. So the lifted index is going to fall to something maybe what, -4, -5 on the morning of the 12th of October 2015. And that's pretty unstable, and that's when we're going to have some rainfall, so those might be convective squalls, maybe even a few thunderstorms. The red line is wind speed, and notice that the we look at the at the top of that little panel for the key, and notice that the wind speed starts at 0, and then there's a line, and then 9.1 knots, and then there's a line, and then 18.3 knots. Tonight at 0600 hours UTC, the wind is going to blow about 18 or 19 knots. It will settle down a little bit on the 12th of October 2015, and then it picks back up on the 13th to around 18, 19, maybe 20 knots. Also, over on the very right-hand side of that little black box, we see an indication of the wind speed and direction with a wind flag for every 6 hours for the next 7 days as well. And all this information changes wherever I put my cursor. Finally, the last thing is that green line, that's the sea level pressure, and that's going to increase from about 1009 millibars currently to about 1021 millibars on the 16th of October. Let's say that I want to go look at the 12th of October 2015 at 1800 hours and look at that precipitation. The way I can do that really easily, rather than using the backward and forward buttons, is just to come down to the date and time stamp in the lower left-hand corner of the screen, right-click it, and then that brings up all the available times. I can select the one I want to see, and it takes me right there. So we can see that the reason we're going to get precipitation Monday the 12th of October is that there's going to be an area of low pressure up near Cape Lookout, and we're on the south side of that low with some squally weather. What do some of these other buttons do? So this would be to create a new file, to open a file. We don't really use those. WeatherNet opens the file for us automatically. We could print it. You can play around with the horizontal profile. It's really interesting to look at, but I don't think terribly useful. The 3D, similarly interesting to look at, but not terribly useful. The GPS feature, if you hook it up to a GPS Properties panel, that's what where we adjusted the settings. the color key, if you want the color key for whatever parameter you're looking at. I don't find this particularly useful. GRIB options, we can fit all the data to the width of the screen. We can fit all the data to the height of the screen. We can display the actual size, which let's do that. So this displays the actual size, and I've got a lot of data, so it's displayed pretty small. What I suggest you use on a regular basis, the regional zoom, click that. Now, wherever I put my cursor and drag it, I drag a box. So I put my cursor there and I drag a box and release it, and that's the regional zoom. That's the region that I'm going to be looking at the start. We can click and pan to move the screen. So just left click and pan, and that moves the screen. We only have one data file open at the moment, but I'm going to show you another data file open in just a minute. That's the sea state forecast. And once we have more than one file open, we can tile them horizontally or vertically or cascade the windows. So let's go do that. And so we bring up WeatherNet again, and this time we are going to choose the WaveWatch 3 sea state information and download that. That's done. We close WeatherNet and it launches. And that's what the sea state information looks like. So again, we're way zoomed out. So we want to zoom in on the region of interest. And we do that, of course, by clicking on that regional zoom and then dragging a box. We can get rid of this color key. And I like to change the display parameters also for the sea state a little bit. Now, I've had some issues with my machine where this resets, and this seems to be a bug that varies by machine. So some machines may retain the sea state viewing parameters, others don't. This machine does not. So I'm going to open the Properties panel. Wave direction, we will leave in the big red arrows. And that's the default, I believe. Wave height, we are going to take off of default. We're going to paint 10 contour lines. We're going to start at a minimum of 2 feet and go up 1 foot per contour line. And we are going to use the dark blue to purple coloring. So there we have the sea state forecast. We are going to do exactly the same thing with the period of the seas, the interval of the seas. So the wave period, we're going to set exactly the same way. We're going to make the contour lines thicker. We are going to take it off default contours. We want to paint 10 contour lines. We want to start at 2 feet and increase 1 foot per contour line. And we're going to change how the labels look. We want an opaque background. We want an opaque background of white, I guess, is fine. Let's choose a font color of black because that'll show up well on white. We don't need a decimal place. And let's do Arial, bold, and 16 point for the font. And okay, there we are. So I click OK, and now refresh. And what else did I not do? Oh, I didn't change the color palette. So change the color palette to the same blue to purple. And there we are. So let's get rid of the Properties panel, and I will show you what this does for us. Okay, so first let me explain something about the relationship between sea height and interval. In a typical wind-driven wave, the sea height in feet is roughly equal to the interval in seconds. If we have a swell, then the interval in seconds is longer than the height in feet. So how does looking at sea state the way we have it painted on this chart now help us? Well, it helps us here. Let's say that we are out in the Atlantic somewhere to the northeast of Bermuda. We have an immediate visual cue that the waves here are easy swells because the wave height is in blue, which is very, very low on our color scale, and the wave interval is in orange or yellow or green or orange or yellow or orange, which are much higher in color scale. So we can also see in our little status bar at the bottom of the screen that where my cursor is now, the waves are 4 feet high with a 6-second interval. And I'm going to move out of the green toward the yellow and orange, and we go from 4 feet roughly with an 8 or 9-second interval. Now let's look at the waters west of Bermuda. Here's Bermuda. So the waters west of Bermuda, now we have a green color background, which is height of 5.5 feet, and a green line for the interval, which is 6 seconds. So these are wind-driven waves. And where else might we find something interesting? Let's see the waters east of Newfoundland. We can see waters southeast of Newfoundland. We have seas that are yellow, which is about 7.5 feet, with a red interval, which is about a 9 seconds interval. That means it's a fairly easy swell. But if we go over to the same yellow, let's say back here east of Nova Scotia, instead of being 7.3 feet with a 9-second interval, now we're within the yellow contour for interval. We've got a 7-foot sea with a 7-second interval. That's more of a wind-driven wave. Same thing with the purple line here. If we look at the area up here, we've got a 12.5-foot wave with a 12-second interval. Down here, we've got a 9-foot wave with an 11-second interval. So it just helps us see visually. It helps us with a visual cue about the relationship between the interval of the wave and the height of the wave, which helps assess whether it's a wind-driven wave or a swell just by looking at the colors. Anyhow, these are some really neat features in WeatherNet, and I hope you find it as useful as I do.